Well, there's a context to this. In what regard? Bolivia has suffered a coup in November 2019. Unfortunately, this has transformed the diplomatic and political scenery of Bolivia for the worse, unfortunately. And a portion of the government, which represents 5% of the electoral vote, has taken power and has interrupted constitutional normality. So the issue here is that this government, this interim government, whose sole purpose was to call on elections, unfortunately was caught up in the midst of this global pandemic. Now, it is not easy for any country to suffice in the logistics or in policies or in actions that could permit one to positively come out of this in a triumphant manner. It's happening all over the world. But the key problem is here that this being an interim government with very little legitimacy and supported by deep human rights violations, it has also demonstrated an obstructive nature or an illogical nature in how it's permitted us to react to the pandemic. You'll also see in the Worldometer statistics that Bolivia is one of the countries with least testing possibilities. That is a key factor when it comes to the pandemic. Why? Because it permits you to set into place policies or quarantines that are guided by statistics that permit you to take those actions. And one of the problems is that instead of reacting and purchasing testing material, medical supplies, and biosafety equipment for the reaction, we've been now in quarantine for Bolivia for 140 days. 140 days where international tenures have been plagued by corruption and just enormous difficulties. World Bank statistics has stated, based on the emissions that the economy puts into place, that Bolivia has practically shut down the economic possibilities of the country. You have to understand that 70% of Bolivia is still informal. And because it's informal, people live on a day-to-day manner. And this day-to-day manner requires for people to go out in the streets to earn their living. And although it's important to stay home and to try to apply strictly what it means to contain this pandemic, in reality, our people can't do this. And although we could have done this for 30 days, perhaps, to permit the government to, prepare itself for a better response, nothing was done. So we are in a very, very dire situation, and I think we will continually start providing you more information as the report continues. Like I've told you before, it's an unfortunate time for Bolivia because we've been caught in the middle of political and the COVID-19 crisis, which adds on an element of just, catastrophical circumstances. And like I've told you before, with the illegitimacy of this interim government and the lack of will to show a way forward in what you would call free and transparent electoral process, it's become a strain. Just to give you a little bit more context, Bolivia has a large indigenous population. And this large indigenous population for the past 14 years with the past government had some leverage or some democratic participation onto the government. This has stopped from one day to another. So you have that 60% of the people in Bolivia, which are of a indigenous nature, have stopped having true incidence into the political future of Bolivia. And because the people that have been empowered are more biased towards the social elite, to the industrial portions of Bolivia, it has created a disconnect in how to attack the pandemic. From what we've seen in terms of the policies that they want to set forward in the next couple of years, if this government would happen to stay, we see that it's deeply oriented towards export-driven industries, which not necessarily have to do with the day-to-day economy of the families. Now, because this pandemia has been global in nature, you have to understand that as most countries in the developing world, many of our families' economies have to do with what's being sent from families abroad. And this has been, although downplayed before, it's very important for families to have income. And this income has also stopped, and that most of the people that are outside Bolivia, that probably work in formal or semi-informal jobs, construction, perhaps in Italy, in Spain, or perhaps there's a certain level of formality. You have to understand that you have economies in the world which have lost millions and millions of jobs. You can see what's happened in the US, you can see what's happening in Europe. The economy is not moving forward, and this obviously is hindering the possibility of these people sending money back to Bolivia. So it's just a catastrophe. I don't want to be negative, but you have to say it out loud. It's a hard reality, because the people governing, which only represent 5% of the population, do not have the will to address this other 60% of the people. And in Bolivia, prior to this other government that I was part of, you lived in an apartheid system that wasn't fully declared like you would have seen perhaps in South Africa prior to Nelson Mandela. But you still have these deep-rooted racist and classist governments that have led Latin American governments for decades. So I wish I could give you more optimistic views, Akanksha, but I also have the pleasure of using, Opoi and this means of transmitting what we're living here in Bolivia. I have to address the evidence. In November, the Interim Government comes out with a decree, Supreme Decree, number 4078. This was provided to provide immunity to the armed forces so that they could carry out what they ended up doing, killing 23 people, okay? This decree bears in mind a strategy or a mentality on how to deal with people or organizations that you are not fond of. Because dialogue and political demonstrations are part of the democratic world. You're going to have to deal with people democratically protesting against you if you're a government. It doesn't matter where you are in the world. This doesn't mean that you're going to go out and kill them because they are not akin to what you understand should be done. And if you were willing to make a decree of this nature, there's a facet of the government that honestly I cannot be akin to, I cannot be fond of. And when you kill people and you do not permit them to have an impartial investigation, or you just say that these killings were self-inflicted, to me there's something wrong in how you're moving forward in the world. So 22 people, 22 families, and more than 500 people were injured by bullets. None of these families' lives will ever be the same. And this is one of the worst massacres in terms of civilian deaths that we've had in Bolivia for the past 40 years. 40 years. So it brings back bad and old memories of how politics were done years ago, decades ago. And honestly, I think that we have to live with our dead. and we have to respect our dead. And it's one of the key factors that motivates me to insist on declaring these things to the world, because we need an electoral process that permits free and fair elections. We need impartial investigations, and we also need to lead a human right violations investigation as soon as possible. Look, I had been appointed the ambassador of Plurinational State of Bolivia to Germany when this happened. So I had to endure all of this process that happened during October and November was in Germany. To me, it was a very critical and a very depressing time, because I had to deal with it being abroad, as you know, most of the reality that I had been accustomed to the past 14, 15 years crumbled. I cannot deny that there were issues that the past government perhaps should have done differently, of course. By no means do I think any government is perfect. But I think to go from that to the type of governance that we have today is quite radical. It's quite radical in trying to erase the historical achievements that Bolivia had attested to for the past 10, 15 years, that had been credited by the World Bank, by United Nations as one of the greatest periods of economic growth and just social prosperity in the country, to go back to a small portion of the population trying to digress towards what I described to you before, a social structure that more looks like an apartheid system. An apartheid system that divides the social construct between the indigenous and a small, niche part of the society, which was accustomed to providing political posts from family member to family member. So this is a huge change, and I think this won't come easily. And although the things that happened in Bolivia quickly show that there was a military coup because of the use of the military forces and the way a military high commander stated that the president should retire, which in no means should ever happen. There's also a psychological component that permitted the social urban people to understand that they were going to be invaded, that they were going to be harassed or killed by the rural populations, the ones that they would call the criminals, that to this day they still call the criminals. They call them the Indians, not because of India, it's because of our indigenous nature. And this dichotomy, this hatred, truly hurts, because it opens up wounds that are still there, that apparently were not addressed enough or emphatically enough. But I think that this happens around the world. We tend to have a greater knowledge and greater appreciation of foreign cultures than we do of our own. Thank you very much for the interview, to your audience.